Perfect. Please turn on the chat function. I'm sure you're all familiar with it by now, but if not, hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen and then you'll see the chat button, which you can click on and then enter your question there. And also to get the most out of this evening, please ensure you have speaker view turned on instead of gallery view. And this will make sure that you can properly see our speakers when they're talking. So good evening and welcome to Broadview's National Online Reading Club. My name is Emma Prestwich and I'm Broadview's digital editor. Working behind the scenes to help me out tonight is Chloe Tejada, Broadview's assistant digital editor. Do you want to wave? Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for taking an hour out of your evening to be here with us. We want to acknowledge that Broadview's office is on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the original owners and custodians of this land. Today, this place is home to many, including a diverse urban Indigenous community of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis.
This meeting is being recorded.
We would love to know who you are and where you're from. So please say hello from your hometown and your congregation, if you belong to one, in the chat space. This evening, we're going to hear from contributor Jonisha Lewinson and writers Arun, Srinivasan, and Luke Ottenhof. In a few moments, I will introduce you to our great guests. Just a few more notes. I'm sure many of you who have been to our reading clubs before are familiar with the format, but after our guests have told us a little bit about themselves and their work, we'd love if you could ask some questions. So there are two ways to do so. You can type, "I have a question" into the chat and I'll call on you as time allows, or you can just type your question into the chat and I will ask it for you. So we're going to get started with Luke. Luke Ottenhof is a freelance writer based in Kingston, Ontario. He's been freelancing full-time for 5 years and generally reports on power, how it operates, who has it, and who doesn't. In our April-May issue, he wrote about the former Davis Tannery site in Kingston, a patch of land under threat of development that has become a microcosm of issues facing communities all over the world. Welcome, Luke.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thank you so much for being here.
Everybody's laughing.
Love it. So should I say my piece now, Emma?
Yes, please.
Okay, lovely. It's so awesome to be here and chatting with so many cool folks. So happy to, see so many people here. And I'm really grateful for everyone's time.
I'm just trying to find his.
I'm Luke Ottenhof. I'm a freelance writer based in Kingston, Ontario. I wrote a story on a local struggle over the future of a brownland site near downtown Kingston that's known locally as the Davis Tannery. So in the 1800s and 1900s, an industrial tannery operated on the site, dumped a lot of toxic waste, so the soil's heavily contaminated. Since the tannery buildings were demolished in the 70s and 80s, the site has sat undeveloped and has grown into like a weird sort of beautiful, scrappy wetland environment that's home to a lot of trees, animals, and even some unhoused people in Kingston who have been chased from other areas of the city. A local developer and his company now own the site and want to develop it into 1,500 condos and apartments, in addition to some other things that they have planned for the site. A lot of people are opposed to this development for a lot of different reasons. And I think those reasons are quite existential and universal, even though this is a really local affair. So I thought it was an important story to think about. I was drawn to this story because I don't report a lot on Kingston, which is where I grew up and where most of my family still lives. So it felt nice to report on a place that I'm really deeply connected to. But I think in particular, what really interested me with this story is this idea that of whether or not we're learning from our mistakes. We know categorically what, for example, what causes climate crisis, but we haven't halted or really slowed oil and gas production. It's sped up, in fact, despite the fact that we have very clear evidence of how our past behaviors have landed us in hot water. So I thought this is true. I saw a through line with the tannery here. Industry on that site abused the land for over a century, and we're seeing the results. The soil's contaminated and can negatively affect any life that is exposed to it. So how do we fix that? Local scientists and academics aren't even totally sure. Many have different views even on how to address it. But there was another angle to this too that I was particularly interested in, and that's to do with poverty and homelessness. In Kingston and elsewhere, poverty and homelessness are at rates I've never seen in my life in Kingston. The housing crisis has really impacted Kingstonians. Our rental rates, for example, for 1 and 2 bedroom apartments spiked more than any other municipality in Canada last year. What caused this? To me, the most obvious culprits are financialization of housing, kind of rampant, and a corresponding failure of governments to rein this in a way that is impactful for poor and working class people. So you often hear people in Kingston discussing the need for more housing. So a development that would bring 1,500 more units sounds like a no-brainer. But unless it's truly affordable, does it matter that much if we're building for rich people and abandoning poor and working people to homelessness? This is what I saw in this struggle. Affordable housing has become a real buzzword, and the developer who owns the tannery claims he wants to build some of the units as affordable. But I learned while reporting this story that even housing that was built using funding from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation designated for affordable housing, often those developments didn't end up really being materially, meaningfully affordable for people. 1 bedroom still renting for $1,500 a month. What this says to me is that the way we're doing things is hurting working and poor people, and the effects are compounding and they're getting worse. So we see the results of these mistakes in a lot of different places, these bad past behaviors all around us. More and more unhoused people, more and more people barely scraping by, people being evicted and priced out of their homes and communities. We see the evidence every day. Every national paper has a new daily headline about housing costs, cost of living. Yet we're not doing things that much differently. So shouldn't we be committing to altering our courses here? These are all very different struggles that I saw involved with the future of this piece of land, the Davis Tannery. But I think each has in common this existential thread of what I believe to be capitalism's indifference to its own wrongs. Species extinction, climate disasters, housing crises, these are all apparent, but we still haven't changed course on a lot of these things. So these are some of the thoughts that motivated my interest in the Davis Tannery and all the people trying to get others in Kingston and elsewhere to think critically about how we're living and organizing ourselves, how we're structuring the spaces around us. I don't have answers to these big questions, but as a writer, I like to think it's a bit of my responsibility to raise these questions and encourage people to think about them. I like learning about and reporting on stories that might look small or insignificant or provincial, but which can tell us a lot about life and power and history, far beyond the actual subjects or events. So that was a little bit about my story, why I wanted to report on it. Thanks for listening. So yeah, turning it back over.
Thank you so much, Luke.
Yeah.
Now an opportunity for some questions. So I'm going to open it up to the floor if anyone has something they'd like to ask Luke. I can get started. So you mentioned this story does have so many threads in it, from the biodiversity and ecological impacts to the housing, the fact that it illustrates the kind of housing crisis that Kingston is experiencing. Are there examples in Kingston of people actually addressing these problems? It sounds to the advocates that you spoke to that it is an example of these issues not being addressed. Are you seeing examples in the city that encourage you, either on housing, from an ecological standpoint, biodiversity, etc.?
Definitely, yeah. There are, like, I spoke with a couple of folks for the story who I think are doing great work to bring people's attention to these things. I mean, I live downtown, and right across the street, I would look out the window and see a group of older folks who are standing there with flyers, with big boards with information on them, talking about the Davis Tannery, and specifically about this 150-ish year old oak tree. I mentioned it in the story, but specifically advocating for this big beautiful tree that's on this property, which would be cut as part of the clear cut. So there's a group called No Clear Cuts in Kingston that is doing a lot of great work to bring attention to this and this sort of I guess the tendency of development to steamroll over what they look at as very important environments. There's also a group in Kingston called the Kingston Union of Tenants, or Kingston Cataraqui Union of Tenants, KUT. They're actually having a rally tomorrow evening at City Hall, 6 p.m. for anyone who's interested in that sort of thing. They advocate quite militantly, I think, for housing for all, for housing as a human right, and for, poor and working Kingstonians who are feeling squeezed by the sort of development and building that, that is commonplace. So those groups, I would say, are two beacons for me personally. They give me a lot of encouragement, I guess.
That's great. Michael has a question. Michael, go ahead.
Hi, Luke. Thanks very much for the great piece and your thoughts on it today. Really interested in it as someone who is an ecologist and works in this field as well. So that was really great. A few points in the story, there's sort of the comment is made that, and the sentiment that kind of nature knows better. And I would sort of agree with that in some cases and challenge that in others as well. And I think in the fields of restoration, especially, we're getting a lot better at sort of learning from sort of nature, if you will, and sort of how to work with those processes and facilitate those processes and sort of not try and override it. So I'm sort of wondering how much sort of work has sort of been done at looking at the options in terms of phytoremediation, for example, or this sort of thing, and how some of the people you spoke to might respond to some of these things in favor of more of a naturalized kind of process, especially keeping in mind that some of these remediation processes can be sort of look really kind of rough in the first few years and can take a number of years to sort of produce results that people are sort of looking for in terms of regrowth and vegetation.
Totally. And that's something that personally I find difficult to navigate, because there are, like you said, there are a lot of ugly aspects up front. But at the same time, trying to hold that while also holding the fact that this is a brutally contaminated piece of land that poses risk to, I assume poses risk to life that interacts with it. It's something that I think in the story, I wanted to pull out this idea that there isn't really consensus on, like, even locally among academic researchers at Queen's. There are a couple of different groups. There's a group in Kingston advocating for the watershed and the river called River First. So they come at this from how will the river be impacted? There's the group No Clear Cuts coming at how will the trees be impacted? How will this impact the surrounding area to, cut down and kind of flatten an area that is at present seems like it performs a significant function in mitigating flood risk. So it's a really good question. And I think it's one that's being, honestly, like, heads are being butted on all sides, I think, to try and figure out how best to do this. Because another component of this is that Transport Canada, the federal government, has potential plans to dredge the inner harbor to clean it up, which is the area adjacent to the tannery. So I wish I had a cleaner answer, and I'm also, you probably know more about this than I do. But I think you make like really critical points that there are, it's important to hold both of those things, I guess, going forward, not hands off. I really like what this person in Kingston, Jeremy Malloy, told me for the story, which is that I think he says we're not being called upon to solve, we're just being called upon to respond. We're being called upon to figure these things out together. So I I apologize that I don't have a better answer, but that's a great question, and things that I really look forward to learning more about going forward.
Thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting and tricky one. Yeah, thank you very much.
Totally, thank you.
Linda has a question. Linda's wondering, since the land was abandoned and is naturalizing, have any studies been done on the level of remediation that needs to be done? Have any of the living species, plants and animals, been tested for any of the toxins? And is naturalization possibly detoxing the land and water?
This is a good question that I wish I had 7 to 8 more years of university to know the answer to completely. But yeah, so there has definitely been analysis done on the land that has determined there are harmful levels, by whatever the metrics are, harmful levels of chromium, zinc, mercury, other chemicals that have been used in the tanning and smelting operations that were on the site. Definitely, like from a surface level perspective, the tannery lands appear to be beautiful and thriving. There's, you take a walk through and you see rabbits, squirrels, birds, all sorts of flora and fauna. Turtles bask along the shores in the summertime into the fall. But I'm personally not aware of, studies that have been done on the vegetation that's been growing there right now. I know the soil is definitely appears to me to be the biggest cause for concern. And I know some local advocates are pushing for just a naturalization process. The tannery will take care of itself. I know there are some other locals who are very sensitive to these issues, who say that's not good enough. This is a dangerous site and it needs to be cleaned up, and it can be cleaned up in a way that's responsible and caring and demonstrates stewardship for the land. So it's a good question. I don't know, for sure one way or the other. I think what I hope the story conveys is that I'm not sure there is one totally agreed upon solution, but hopefully in the coming together and discussing these things, we're able to find a good course forward. So naturalization, maybe that does play a role here. I mean, I assume it will in some form, but I can't say for sure whether that's going to be the thing that takes care of all this.
At us as journalists, we try to do our best to understand it, but that's completely understandable. Catherine has a question for you.
Hi, good evening. A couple questions. One is, if this is a wetland, where does the local conservation authority play a role? And has it not been designated in the official plan for wetland and non-development? And two, have there been any discussions about having some level of government expropriate it and make it more of a conservation area, or maybe have the portion that's closest to the water be naturalized and just left alone, and then maybe the upper part, I'm assuming it's quite a large site, that gets the true affordable housing, because of course the federal government right now is talking about 40,000 units, and maybe there would be a way to get some kind of a program going so you can have your affordable housing and you can have your naturalization on the waterfront.
Totally, yeah, great question. And there's, I would say like a hybrid. I feel like I'm going to be repeating myself, so I apologize. But there are a number of like groups advocating for all of these things. There are some folks who are advocating for programming it in a way that it, yeah, is just a conservation area, is fixed up to some extent, but then is redesigned, reprogrammed. As a conservation area, there are some folks who say, well, let's leave the waterfront alone. Let's build further back towards towards the street that it abuts. And so the local conservation area here, Cataraqui Regional Conservation Authority, I believe, they released a paper or response letter kind of in response to the developer's plans with a number of concerns that they would like to see satisfied before they signed off on supporting the project. But another piece here that I want to raise is that the developer is also, I believe, for the development to go forward, what the developer would need to get is a ministerial zoning order from the province to rezone this wetland to allow a certain type of construction on it, which is another big point of concern for a lot of local folk. The precedent that would be set by, rezoning wetland for development. I know I believe in Cambridge, they recently came up against something similar, and the MZO wound up not going through, I believe. Anyway, those are some pieces of this. Did that answer your questions adequately?
Thank you.
I know we had a few more questions, especially a couple related to affordable housing. There is a chance afterwards for some more informal questions, so it's completely up to you, Luke, but if you wanted to stick around for a few minutes after our regular program's finished, we can get to everyone's questions.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Our next guest is Jonisha Lewinson. Jonisha is currently a third-year student at Sheridan College studying creative writing and publishing. She grew up in the United Church and enjoys helping out where she can. She also loves working with children and has a passion for anything creative. Srinivasan interviewed her for a story in our April-May issue about the Young Black Scholarship Program. Jonisha's research focused on the mental health of Black people in the United Church of Canada, as well as Black youth, and also some history of Black people in Canada and the United Church. Please join me in welcoming Jonisha.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the research as well as like the interview that I did as part of the United Church of Canada's Young Black Scholarship Program. So just to recap, back in 2021, I was recruited as one of the 6 young Black scholars that would be conducting research pertaining to the lives of Black people in the United Church. And each of us were given the opportunity to pick what we wanted to research. So I decided to look into the history, mental health of Black people, as well as Black youth in the United Church of Canada. And then of course I was interviewed, and now I'm speaking with you guys today. So let me just get right into it. So for the research project, before the research project started actually, I had kind of had like a calling to do this type of work, and I didn't really know how to get my foot in the door. And after the things that happened with George Floyd and everything like that, I just knew that I needed to do some sort of work in this area. And luckily my pastor from my church had actually sent me a link to the research project, and the rest was really history. As for the history aspects of the project, I wanted to look into the history of Black people in the United Church, and that proved a lot harder than I thought it would, just because there is very minimal information about Black people in Canada, let alone Black people specifically in the United Church of Canada. Though through the research that I did, I was able to find little snippets of information, basically like the overall understanding I came to was that when Black people had immigrated to Canada, they were met with a lot of hostility by other by white congregants in the United Church and were forced to make their own churches, and those churches for them ended up becoming like a safe haven and a place that wasn't just somewhere to what's called to explore their spirituality, but it was also a place where they had community. It would also serve as an education center, a medical center. So it was just a really like kind of like family place for them to be in. Another thing related to the history of Canada, since there was little information on it, we had to kind of rely on our interviews, things like that, and the lived experiences of people who are going to United Churches now or have been to United Churches in the past. The next thing that I looked into was mental health. It was an area that I was interested in because, as I feel like a lot of us, I struggled with my mental health over the past couple of years, and I thought it was important to shed some light on the topic. And through my research, I discovered that mental health tends to be stigmatized in Black social groups because it is believed that mental health issues stem from demons and evil spirits invading someone's soul, which hasn't helped Black people try and find help for their mental health, and they usually tend to just kind of set it aside. For that, I ended up writing a spoken word piece that talks about the experience of dealing with mental health issues in an environment where mental health is kind of treated as something that can just be prayed away. I'll add the link to that spoken word later, but I thought I'd just point that out. I also talked about, I also researched Black youth in the United Church. Having grown up in the United Church, I found that my toughest years was when I was a teen. More than ever, I felt like I needed, that was when I needed spiritual guidance, and unfortunately, I didn't receive it. And through my research, I found out that I wasn't alone, and that many youth and adults in the church voice that youth programs nowadays are more focused on entertaining youth rather than giving them the space to explore and ask questions about their faith. And through the research, I found that many youth are kind of leaving the church and finding other ways to satisfy that spiritual urge in their souls. And I learned that if churches want youth to continue staying in church, they need to create programs that stimulate their minds and recognize them as growing adults that have questions about faith and everything, and not just children who want to be entertained. So since being interviewed, I did a podcast about my spoken word piece with my pastor, which was an amazing experience. It was great to just have an honest and vulnerable conversation about mental health and how it is treated in the United Church. Sorry. In addition to that podcast, a few months ago, I helped create the first draft of the United Church of Canada's anti-racism training for youth ages 13 to 18, which was quite exciting. And other than that, I've really just been focusing on school, which has been great and stressful. And I also hope to work on some more anti-racism work later on, but I don't really know what that work is just yet. And yeah, that's it.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Your congregation is lucky to have you, and I know that the your voice and your perspective doing this research is really appreciated. From the research that you did into the Black mental health experience, did you feel like your church and the United Church in general did the people you spoke to feel like the church offered them help and support in those areas, or was the church maybe not quite as helpful, or was it a mix of both?
It really depended on who I talked to and what church they went to, because I didn't just interview people from the United Church. I also want to see how people were in other different types of churches. but I would say the grand scheme of them would say that, especially in the past, churches did not offer much support when it came to mental health. And it was kind of like what I was talking about, like prayed away type of mentality, where it wasn't coupled with possibly getting like a therapist or seeing a doctor or something like that. Yeah. There's something else I was going to say, but then I forgot. So I'll just leave it at that.
Catherine in the chat is wondering about the name of your podcast.
Sure, I can actually put the links to the spoken word and the podcast in the chat now.
Wonderful.
So this is the spoken word piece, and this is the link to the podcast.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there anything from your research that really surprised you?
I would probably say the most surprising thing I learned was that Black people have been in Canada since like the 1600s, which I thought was pretty incredible, but it also made me recognize that there's a lot of work that needs to go into history that is taught now, as it isn't very often talked about that Black people do live in Canada, and we've been living here for quite a while, which is unfortunate, but I have hope that those types of things will change in coming curriculums and things like that.
So just as a reminder, everyone is welcome to ask questions. I've got a few that I'm going to ask Jonisha, but please enter your question in the chat if you have one. I'm wondering, the anti-racism curriculum that you're developing, are there particular things that you wanted included when you were working on it?
That's a great question. I think I kind of saw it, since it was geared towards youth, I wanted it to be relatable more than anything, because I think a lot of curriculums are kind of made by people it's not targeted towards, which can make it a little bit difficult to get through the curriculum. So when I was working with the people with the for making the curriculum, we kind of just made sure that it was things that we could relate to, and like, for example, situations or examples that we put in there were things that youth have probably experienced before, and also just the way in wording things to make sure it made sense, providing definitions for certain terms that aren't really talked about or aren't made clear. Anything specific that I wanted to be included? I would say covert racism. So things that in the moment, if somebody had said to you and you're like, that felt odd, but I don't know if it's actually like, if it actually constitutes as racism. So like maybe like the question of where are you from, which in and of itself I don't think is a very bad question, but it's the context of which it's being asked. Like when I'm asked that question, people will be like, oh, where are you from? And I'm like, oh, I was born in England. And they're like, okay, but where were your parents from? I'm like, they were also born in England. And they kind of want me to go all the way back until I say Africa, which I think is a little bit unfair. And I think when asking that question, you just need to be aware of what is your reason for asking that question and what your end goal. Like if your end goal is trying to get them to say Africa, then it's probably not a good idea to ask the question. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a question that if asked to everyone would be different, but the context definitely matters. Marion has a question. She's wondering, did you have any contact with BC congregations founded by Black settlers? Our congregation was founded by a Black pastor who came here in 1858.
I did not have any contact with people in BC. I think someone in the group that I was working with did actually research into that. I did, I would say, light research into the history, as I wanted to focus more on mental health and youth. So I wouldn't really be able to speak much to that, though I do know there were a lot of Black settlers in BC and like in the prairies and stuff like that.
Brenda's wondering whether or not you see Black history being taught in schools. The Underground Railroad is part of Canadian history, but when I went to school, it was never mentioned.
I would really hope that one day we'll see Black history being taught in schools. I also know from experience that it was never talked about. I think the only time I remember Black history, in a sense, being talked about was, I mean, other than the Underground Railroad, was during the war and the one Black battalion that helped. But other than that, it was never talked about, even though, as I learned through research, that there is a very robust history of Black people in Canada. I know, I think they're making a curriculum, they're changing it to include Indigenous people in the curriculum now, which I think is a great start. And I think over time, we'll see that more cultures and more ethnicities will be included in the history that's taught to children.
Virginia says she's interested in your comment that church youth groups provide entertainment rather than exploring spiritual questions. So she's wondering whether you can say a bit more about this.
Sure. I'll give like an example of like what I experienced transitioning from like the younger children's program into the youth program. I found that my youth program was kind of just geared to keeping people in the room. So conversations would end up getting thrown off to talk about maybe like video games or anime or just things that weren't really related to church at all. And it became like I remember there's like a table of like sweets and things like that you could buy, like end up feeling more like a recreation center than a place where I could actually talk about spirituality. And it actually kind of pushed me out of the church. Yeah, but a little bit. Oh, she's yeah, but that's what I'd say to that. It was just more trying to find a place where I felt like I belonged and that I could really like explore my spirituality more.
Sure, something a little deeper.
Yeah, definitely.
Rob has a question. Rob, do you want to ask your question?
Actually, Virginia already asked my question.
Okay, perfect. Alan, do you want to go ahead? You were wondering about microaggressions. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
No, I was just saying that I thought that's exactly what she was describing. These questions, where are you from, right? These are, microaggressions, and we have a group that's been looking at anti-racism in our congregation and, explored these kinds of issues. Over.
Yeah, definitely.
One more question from Eldon. He's wondering whether or not you found a relationship between economic disparities and difficulty with mental health issues.
Not so much economic disparities, but I did find disparities in how mental health issues are dealt with, like from the perspective of police and what's the word? Like medical professionals. I read an article that was talking about how Black people were more likely, it was more likely that the police will be called for a mental health issue versus someone calling 911 for that same issue if it was somebody who was white, which I thought was interesting. Yeah, I didn't really find much in terms of economic disparities, but definitely just how it's dealt with in different circumstances.
Well, thank you so much, Jonisha, for being here and for sharing with us. And those who have kids or grandkids, hopefully will have a chance to use the anti-racism curriculum that you've helped develop. So thanks so much. Our final guest will take us to the rink. Arun Srinivasan is a sports writer based out of Toronto. He has written for Yahoo Sports Canada, Vice, and Sportsnet, among other outlets. Arun prides himself on being able to write and cover a wide range of sports. In his spare time, he likes reading, watching Paul Thomas Anderson movies, and rooting for his beloved Buffalo Bills. In our April-May issue, Arun wrote about racism in Canada's national winter sport and spoke to the insiders who are trying to combat the problem. His book about the history of racism in hockey is expected to be released in 2023. Please join me in welcoming Arun.
Well, hey everyone, thanks for tuning in and listening to me. I'm super lucky to be on this panel with Emma, Luke, and Jonisha. You guys did a wonderful job telling your stories, and hopefully I can do a good job of telling mine. So just a bit about me. I've written about various sports throughout my career, and even now you'll see me writing random Raptors blogs or hockey analysis pieces or covering rugby. But this piece really meant a lot to me. It allowed me to sort of indulge some of my deeper reporting instincts. So just a little bit about me. 3 years ago, when I got hired at Yahoo Sports Canada, I made a point that there was a void in the market when it came to covering race and sports and the intersection of sort of race and sports, politics and sports. So I wrote a piece in the summer of 2019 that criticized the National Hockey League for their diversity initiatives, how they were sort of pandering to gay and trans communities and not doing anything actionable. That piece took off, and then I sort of developed a bit of a reputation for being one of the NHL's like main critics, at least in the print media. So that wasn't always my intention when I came into sports media, but it has developed an interest of mine over the years. So with this feature, it was cool right from the outset. My main editor in this piece, Chrissy Woodstra at Broadview, outlined to me that we should really look at a solutions-oriented angle to racism in hockey. And I think right away, it became clear to me in the research process that we should focus on organizations that are working to combat racism in hockey. I think at this point, you know, especially after the 2020 we had, after the murder of George Floyd, and after, you know, combating anti-Black racism became such a prominent part of sort of North American discourse, you know, that's when I sort of really sort of started taking this to a new level and start writing a lot more. So, so there were certain, you know, thematic ties to the book I'm writing on, and I think right away there were a bunch of people from the outset that I wanted to interview. So Ted Nolan, where my piece starts off, he was a really elusive figure for me for my book to get, but he has been such a strong advocate for, you know, Indigenous hockey players, building a support system. He grew up on a, you know, Garden River First Nation, and you know, he was racially abused as soon as he left to further his hockey career in Kenora. He felt he got blacklisted from the NHL, from the coaching circuit, and I thought leading with Ted at an event that was designed for the next wave of teenagers would be a good way to sort of introduce the story. And then I think there's a real, paradox. I probably should have led my talk with this, is that in Toronto, which prides itself on being the hockey capital of the world, there are the most rinks in the world in Toronto. The Greater Toronto Hockey League, the main youth organization here, is the biggest sort of incubator of hockey talent in the world. And yet hockey, especially at the elite youth levels, is so inaccessible. It's so expensive. It sort of prices out a wide range of people from different sort of class and racial identities. And that was sort of an area to explore. I think what has frustrated me over the years is that the Greater Toronto Hockey League and I guess the umbrella, the governing body for hockey in this country, Hockey Canada, is either paid lip service or they'll come up with a nice, carefully crafted statement that's been run by their comms team, and then they won't follow up on that, despite Hockey Canada having just infinite resources. So I found it sort of interesting to sort of explore a lot of Toronto-based organizations. With Anthony Stewart and Hockey Equality, he's providing professional level instruction to aspiring players, a lot of Black players and Indigenous players, but not exclusively necessarily, and giving them sort of that sort of subsequent ice time that that a lot of their peers have. In fact, two of Anthony's kids tonight are playing in a nationally televised game right now, which I'm going to watch soon. Malcolm Spence and Justin Hune, they're playing for Mississauga Senators tonight in what is the premier youth hockey game in the province, and I would say in Canada right now, the OHL Cup final. And then with Time to Dream Foundation, Akeem Alou. So Akeem and I are both the same age, and growing up, he was a neighborhood legend. Like, he was the best soccer player and one of the best hockey players in my age group. I've wanted to interview Akeem for years, and getting to talk to Aaron Atwell, who played on Akeem's hockey team, and works with Time Stream Foundation. It was a great interview. I've wanted to talk to this guy for like 20 years. But it was sort of fascinating is the wrong word, but it was definitely interesting to speak to Aaron because, you know, growing up, like, their team lost like one game. These guys were neighborhood heroes. And then yet their sort of behind the scenes experiences in hockey were just so brutal. The race in the face on the ice, sort of the racist implications they've had as they've tried to further their professional careers. For those of you who don't know, with Akeem Alou, he was racially abused several times by a player named Steve Downey, who called him a wide range of racial epithets. And yet when the story came out in 2005, the national media tried to paint him as a 16-year-old uncoachable player who was getting in the way of this Canadian hero, this 18-year-old guy named Steve Downey, who went and then played for the Canadian World Junior team the following month and was named to the tournament MVP team, the alternate all-star team rather. So that was really sort of a frustrating dynamic in the media that was wanting to explore. So I wanted to focus on hockey equality, Time Stream Foundation, and shoot, why am I blanking on that one? And the Future of Hockey Lab, among others, because they were doing something actionable. I think we've all learned sort of anti-racism language, which is just a great step. And I think also too, a lot of organizations that are trying to combat racism are so fixated on representation. Like, that's great. Representation does matter, but it's not the end point to affecting sort of proportional, I get, well, not representation, but, you know, a better system for people of color in sports. Representation is just a start. You know, building actionable programming around it, I think, is the more important component. So it was sort of cool to see that there are a bunch of organizations committed to this. You know, the work has just started for some of them. I wish I had more time to spend in the Future Hockey Lab, which is doing really innovative research there. They want to make it clear to me for the story that they are not a think tank. They're an actionable physical lab that are just doing means testing to sort of how to combat racism in sports. So anyways, that's sort of what drew me to the story. Otherwise, I'm just sort of watching the Maple Leafs like a normal guy, I guess. I don't know.
Like a perennial optimist.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. You mentioned the expense and how that keeps so many youth out. Are there any initiatives you're seeing to make hockey cheaper?
Well, like Hockey Equality tries to do that by providing like professional level instruction from Anthony Stewart, who played in the NHL for several seasons. His brother Chris played in the NHL for a lot longer too. So you're sort of seeing that, but it's meant to sort of be sort of an ancillary piece and rather being sort of a foundational piece of Canadian hockey. For example, this quote did not make it to the final version of my story, but I interviewed James Naylor, who's the president of Toronto Marlboros Hockey Club, which has hosted Connor McDavid and Maple Leafs captain John Tavares, among others of minor hockey players. And he told me that the average operating budget per player is $15,000 to $20,000 per season. So if you really want that elite caliber of hockey, it's simply just not tenable unless or what's often happened, and which has been happening since I was a kid in the minor hockey system 20 odd years ago, is that someone's affluent parent will pay, you know, the kids. And sure, I guess that works, but is that sustainable? It isn't. And these programs that are meant to sort of make hockey more affordable and the people doing the work, that's great, but they can't be seen as sort of the standard fill-in. They're meant to be ancillary programs to sort of eradicate the gap between affluent players who can afford year-round ice time.
But they're not making it cheaper overall.
I don't think so. I mean, and again, I think some of the organizations I profiled are trying their best, but again, they are just meant to be almost like one-off programs. Has Hockey Canada adopted a more, less expensive model overall? They haven't shown much of an inclination to do so. I would hope that would change. I would hope that stories like this put a little bit of pressure on them a little bit, but we'll see. My fingers are crossed. I do try to be optimistic a little bit, but there really should be more pressure on a national governing body to build this program when they get a ton of funding from the government to make it happen.
Paul has a question. Paul, go ahead. Paul, are you still here? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, thanks. Great story, Aaron. I really enjoyed it. Question, I'm a big hockey fan and sports fan. There was a part in your story toward the end where you were looking at a situation, I think it was in Nova Scotia or maybe PEI, where there was a game and there was a player of color who was called out at the game and then after the game by some other players who said hockey is a white people's sport or something like that. To me, that's shocking, but it happened. Where do you think that comes from in, young people playing hockey who can call out somebody in that way? I mean, this goes beyond, does it go beyond hockey? Is this,
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, where do young people get the confidence to call a 15-year-old kid like Mark Connors the N-word? I don't know. I mean, racism is a learned behavior.
Yeah.
I think you would have to sort of look at hockey in Canada as a broad mirror for Canadian society as a whole, right? I mean, like how does a teenager become emboldened to say racist things? I'm not entirely sure what the answer is, but you would have to think that on just a simpler level, that racism is a learned behavior. There probably was no, probably not a whole ton of adult supervision. In fact, one of the guys I interviewed for the piece, Sean Fitzgerald, who's a senior writer at The Athletic, who's written extensively about the culture of youth hockey in Canada, he more or less said the same thing when I sort of asked him as a minor hockey coach, how does one sort of combat that? And he just said, like, a lot of them, well, there's like lack of, the kids who are getting away, the kids are saying this stuff probably aren't getting a whole lot of parental supervision, or probably learned this behavior from their parents or in their community and haven't been taught otherwise. So I don't know. I mean, how to explain why people say racist things is a tough one, but that would be my guess. And is this specifically a hockey issue? It is not. You have to look at hockey as a mirror for Canadian society as a whole, especially considering how entrenched it is in our culture.
Yeah, thank you.
Eldon has a question. Eldon, go ahead.
Paul, it's interesting that you asked the question, how does this come about? And it seems to me we overlook the main source, and the main source is ourselves. We have to look at ourselves and say, what are our own attitudes? What are the attitudes of family? What are the attitudes of friends? And it come to mind the words from South Pacific, where the musical of Rodgers and Hammerstein, which is a racially charged Broadway musical, because in it the relationship between the American soldier and the native, I believe, Tonganese lady, the words are said, "You've got to be taught before it's too late to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught." And I think as I watched my grandchildren, and most recently my first great-grandchild, he doesn't have an ounce of prejudice and bias in him as he reaches for his eighth month of birth. But should he become a racist, which I would hope would not ever happen, but should he become one, it's because it's in my view, a learned behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. And when you look at the youth hockey organizations, that's always, for me, I think the toughest part to sort of reconcile. Obviously adults sharing their stories of how they've been racially abused is awful for sure. But when it happens at a youth level, when hockey is meant to sort of, build community and, it was, I mean, when I played hockey as a kid, it was an overwhelmingly positive experience for me. And yet, I was like racially abused too. I can't imagine how much worse it is for Black and Indigenous kids too in this country. So it's, it always breaks my heart when it happens to kids. Like, it shouldn't, if especially if minor hockey is celebrated in communities all across the country as sort of a fabric of Canadian life, to sort of build social skills. and that's what always kills me. So, you know, I hope, you know, things get better for your great grandson's, you know, generation of kids. And certainly there are a lot of stories in hockey that should be celebrated. There are lots of positive stories here, so it's not all, you know, it's not always this dreary. But yeah, those stories always just break my heart when it happens to kids at youth level, you know, especially because, you know, in my opinion, racism is a learned behavior. So
one more question from Carolyn. Carolyn's wondering, have hockey owners or players ever thought about taking a levy or a certain percentage from the players or owners to support those who are not able to pay to play?
that's a great question. As far as the NHL goes, I don't believe they have. There was like an interesting story about 20 years ago where this guy named Stuart Hyman tried to buy half the teams in the Greater Toronto Hockey League. He sort of tried to privatize minor hockey. His intentions were originally good, but when he bought a certain number of teams, they basically said he was an oligopoly of sorts, so he couldn't help. And his son Zach ended up is first line winger on the Edmonton Oilers now. So, but other than that, that's like the only time I can really recall like a broad push from NHL owners. I mean, like John Tavares, the Leafs captain, tried to buy the Toronto Marlboros organization, which is a great idea in principle. But again, this is a team that again has a $20,000 a year player budget. Like it's not. There have been efforts to sort of like help minor hockey, but as far as my research shown, there hasn't really been a broad scale effort from NHL owners or players to sort of make things more accessible. I hope that answers your question. If I answered a different question by accident, that's my bad. But as far as I know, there hasn't really been much of a push.
Well, it is really encouraging from your story and from what you shared to see the folks within hockey that are working on these issues. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time.
Well, thank you for having me.
So that brings us to the end of our official program. Thank you so much to all of you for being here tonight. Thank you especially to Luke, Jonisha, and Arun, who volunteered their time to make this event possible. We're very grateful to all of you. Tomorrow we'll be sending you all a short survey by email so you can share your thoughts with us about this event. The costs to produce Broadview's online reading club are minimal, but not non-existent. So if you enjoyed this event or past ones, please consider making a small donation. Even $5 or $10 would help. Please go to broadview.org/donate. Broadview reading clubs, there are more than this one, exist across Canada. So if you're interested in joining a local club or starting one of your own, please check out our info pages at broadview.org/reading clubs. And if your club isn't already listed on that page, please let us know so we can spread the word. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media. After the event ends, you can also stay if you'd like. I know there were some more questions that we didn't get a chance to get to for an informal discussion time. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. Be well, and hope to see you back here again for our next online reading club on June 6th, where we'll discuss the June issue. Good night, everyone.